Cold rain beat down on my face as Roy, a security guard who had known me for 3 years, gripped my elbow and guided me toward the exit. It felt like I was being marched out of a high-security prison, not the office building where I had spent the best years of my life. Through the large glass windows of the second-floor break room, I could see the warm glow of party lights. They had colorful balloons floating against the ceiling and crystal flutes raised in a toast. The centerpiece of the celebration was Chloe Miller, a 29-year-old with a brand-new master's degree from Stanford and a tailored blazer that screamed corporate ambition. She was laughing, surrounded by the very board members who had ignored my emails for the last 6 months. I caught the eye of Julian Thorne, the 56-year-old vice president who had been my boss since the day I signed my contract. He raised his glass to the crowd, looked down at me through the rain-streaked glass, and mouthed 4 words I could read perfectly. "She will fix your mess." Under my arm, I held a single cardboard box that had gone soggy in the downpour, containing Cat Chipafi mug, a few family photos, and 3 years of hard work. I was 49, an age where starting over in the tech industry felt like climbing Everest without oxygen. For 1,095 days, I had lived and breathed the city traffic system. I had skipped family dinners, worked through holidays, and survived on cold takeout to build something that could actually make a difference. OptiGrid Systems had hired me to solve a problem that had paralyzed our metropolitan area for decades. When I arrived, emergency response times were at an all-time high, and the city gridlock was costing local businesses millions every month. I did not just write code. I spent months riding in passenger seats of ambulances, talking to dispatchers, and mapping the psychological flow of commuter behavior. I developed a proprietary software system called the Dynamic Grid Engine. It was not just a static set of rules, it was an adaptive, organic ecosystem that shifted timing based on live data, weather patterns, and even local event schedules. It was beautiful and it worked, but corporate structures do not value genius, they value control. 30 days ago, Julian started his efficiency campaign. He laid off my entire 12-person engineering support team overnight. They did not get warning letters or transition periods. One morning, their badges simply stopped working. I fought for them, citing the Warning Act under 29 U.S.C. paragraph 2101, which requires a 60-day written notice for mass layoffs. Julian had waved his hand dismissively, telling me that legal details were above my pay grade and that we were outsourcing to cut costs. I did not realize then that they were clearing the runway for Chloe. She had spent the last 3 months as a consultant, nodding in meetings and suggesting that my custom-built architecture was unnecessarily complex. Wouldn't a traditional standardized framework be more scalable? She would ask during presentations, displaying colorful slides that had plenty of buzzwords but zero practical substance. Julian loved her slides. They made sense to him, unlike my complex equations and fluid dynamics models. Just 30 minutes before Roy escorted me out, Julian had called me into his office. He did not look me in the eye. He just slid an empty cardboard box across his mahogany desk and muttered something about pursuing alternative methodologies. He said the board wanted someone with more conventional approaches to lead the final implementation phase. I did not yell, and I did not beg. I just packed my few belongings in silence, feeling a cold numbness settle deep in my chest. 3 years of my life dismissed in a 5-minute meeting. Roy avoided my gaze as I loaded the soggy box into the passenger seat of my 10-year-old sedan. He mumbled that he was just following company protocol, and I told him I understood. Nobody wanted to risk their job in this economy. I sat in my idling car, watching the wipers sweep across the windshield, looking at the break room window. The celebration was still going strong. Chloe was holding court, gesturing toward a screen that probably showed one of her clean, empty mock-ups. They thought they had bought the golden goose, but they did not understand that the goose only laid eggs because I was feeding it. The Dynamic Grid Engine was not a plug-and-play software. It was an intricate web of algorithms that required constant, intuitive adjustments. It was coded in my style, using my logic, and designed around my understanding of this specific city. I put my car in gear and drove away, leaving behind the only thing that had given my life meaning for the last 3 years. My social life had turned to dust. My sister had stopped inviting me to weekend gatherings because I was always on call, and my apartment was just a place to sleep. Now even the work was gone, replaced by a smiling 29-year-old who had never seen a real traffic crisis in her life. I drove into the dark evening, wondering how long it would take for the walls to start crumbling down around them. For the first 48 hours after they marched me out, my phone remained completely silent. I spent those 2 days in a kind of daze, pacing my quiet apartment, looking at books I had never had time to read, and watching the city lights flicker from my balcony. My apartment was empty. No pets, no plants. No partner waiting for me, just the echoing quiet of a life that had been entirely consumed by work. I had sacrificed everything for OptiGrid, believing that my unique value would protect me. I was wrong. I was just another line item on a spreadsheet to Julian. Then, On the third morning, the silence broke. It started at 8:15 a.m. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, showing Chloe name on the screen. I watched it ring, vibrate, and finally go silent. 10 minutes later, she called again. By noon, she had tried calling 8 times. By 6 p.m., the count had reached 14. No text messages, no voicemails, just a persistent, increasingly frantic sequence of incoming calls. At midnight, as I sat on my bedroom floor sorting through my old engineering journals, the 19th call came in. The screen lit up the dark room, vibrating against the hardwood floor. I let it ring. I imagined her sitting in the central control room, surrounded by monitors flashing warning red, realizing that her clean theoretical models could not handle the messy reality of 2 million people trying to get home in a rainstorm. I slept soundly that night for the first time in months. The next morning brought a call from Maya Ward, the 27-year-old junior engineer who had survived the layoffs because she was paid a fraction of my salary. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice was hushed and trembling. "Gavin," she whispered, "it is completely falling apart. The entire northern quadrant locked up yesterday afternoon. The gridlock was so bad that ambulances could not get through the main arteries. They had to dispatch emergency helicopters for 3 separate medical incidents. Chloe keeps trying to reset the system using standard textbook parameters, but every reset makes the congestion spread. Julian is losing his mind, and the mayor office has already called twice." I kept my voice flat, refusing to let my emotions leak into the call. "That sounds like a challenging integration phase, Maya." "It is a disaster, Gavin," she said, her voice cracking. "The city is threatening to sue us for breach of contract. They want to cancel the $12,000 agreement. Julian is going to blame you. He is already telling the board you left behind undocumented overrides to sabotage the launch." I smiled in the quiet of my kitchen. "I did not sabotage anything, Maya. The code is clean." But Chloe does not understand how the sectors interact. She is looking for static rules where only adaptive balance exists. Just 2 hours after Maya's call, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Julian standing on my welcome mat. The polished, arrogant executive who had toasted my replacement was gone. His silver hair was disheveled, his expensive tie was loosened, and deep purple shadows hung under his bloodshot eyes. He tried to force a warm, friendly smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "Gavin," he said, his voice raspy. "Can I come in? We need to discuss some technical issues with the implementation." I leaned against the doorframe, blocking the entrance. "I do not work for Optigrid, Julian. You made that very clear when you had Roy march me across the parking lot in front of the entire staff." He winced, looking down the hallway. "That was an administrative necessity. A misunderstanding. Look, the city is experiencing a severe grid crisis. We are willing to bring you back as an independent consultant. We will pay you triple your old salary. That is $495,000 on a 1-year contract. We just need you to stabilize the engine." I looked at the man who had discarded my 3 years of work like garbage. "I will have to pass, Julian." "Gavin, be reasonable," he hissed, his desperate anger breaking through his polite facade. "Lives are at stake. Emergency vehicles are trapped. This is bigger than your bruised ego." "They were always at stake, Julian," I replied calmly. "That is why I worked 70-hour weeks for 3 years. That is why I missed my sister's wedding 2 years ago, sitting in my office to optimize the emergency lanes. You did not care about those lives when you cut my support team to boost your quarterly profits." Julian stepped closer, his face turning red. "If you do not help us, I will make sure the board blacklists you. You will never get another engineering contract in this state." I laughed, the sound loud in the quiet hallway. "Go ahead, Julian. Go tell the board that you fired the lead architect of a $12 million municipal project without securing a transition plan. Tell them how you violated the Warren Act by laying off 12 engineers overnight, which makes the severance agreements we signed legally voidable. And while you are at it, tell them that if Chloe tries to modify my proprietary dynamic grid engine code, she is committing federal copyright infringement under 17 U.S.C. 106. The engine was licensed to Optigrid, not owned, and the license terms explicitly state that unauthorized modifications by non-licensed personnel terminate the agreement. Julian froze, the color draining from his face as the legal reality set in. "Have a good day, Julian," I said and closed the door. I spent that afternoon walking through downtown, seeing firsthand what had happened to my creation. It was painful to watch. The city I had studied for 3 years was choking. Traffic lights changed in bizarre, nonsensical sequences, turning green for empty streets while leaving crowded lanes blocked for minutes. Buses sat idle, commuters paced the sidewalks in frustration, and horns blared in a constant angry chorus. Near City Hall, a local news reporter stood in front of a camera, gesturing toward the gridlock behind him. He was calling it Day 5 of the grid crisis, reporting that emergency response times had spiked by 40% and that 2 traffic fatalities had already occurred because ambulances could not navigate the congested intersections. I went back to my apartment, my stomach twisted in knots. I hated Julian, and I wanted to see Optigrid burn. But the people in those ambulances did not deserve to pay the price for corporate arrogance. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from an unknown number. It read, "Please, for the city. Cafe Lumina, 4 p.m. Mayor Sarah." When I arrived at the small cafe on the edge of the downtown district, Mayor Sarah Jenkins was already waiting in a corner booth. At 51, she had run this city for 4 years, but she looked like she had aged a decade in the last week. The deep lines of exhaustion on her face were clear as she stood to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming, Gavin," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I have not agreed to help." I reminded her as the waiter delivered 2 cups of black coffee. "I know," she said, taking a slow sip, "but you are here, which tells me you still care. You designed a system that was supposed to save lives, Gavin. Now, Optigrid is talking about scrapping the entire project and reverting to the old, outdated traffic system. That would be a tragedy for our city." I leaned back in the booth. "They did not scrap it, Mayor. They fired me, escorted me out with security, and threw a welcome party for my replacement while my personal files were still loading on her screen." Sarah Jenkins stared at me, her eyes widening in surprise. "Fired you?" "Julian Thorne told me you had resigned to pursue other opportunities in the private sector. He said they had transitioned the project to a highly qualified team led by a Stanford graduate to ensure a smoother deployment." I laughed, a harsh, dry sound. They wanted someone they could control. Chloe Miller is a smart consultant, but she does not understand how the dynamic grid engine works. It is not a standard program. It is an adaptive architecture. She is trying to force traditional algorithms onto an organic system. It is like trying to train a wild horse using a bicycle manual. The mayor set her coffee mug down with a firm click. "That explains why the situation is deteriorating hourly. Julian is in over his head and he is lying to the city council. The city is ready to terminate our contract with Optigrid, but we cannot afford to lose the software. Is there any way to run it without them?" "That is where the legal structure comes in," I said, leaning forward. "When I licensed the dynamic grid engine to Optigrid for the city project, I did so under a proprietary developer agreement. Under 17 U.S.C. paragraph 106, I retain the underlying copyright. The contract between the city and Optigrid has a specific performance clause. Under Section 14 of that contract, if the primary contractor fails to deliver functional infrastructure for more than 48 hours, it constitutes a material breach, giving the city the right to terminate the contract immediately and claw back any progress payments." The mayor's eyes sharpened. "We have already paid them $3,000 in progress payments. Can we get that back?" "Yes," I replied. "If they are in material breach, you can claw back that $3,000 and terminate their license. Since their license is terminated, they no longer have the right to run or modify the software. However, the city has a separate emergency clause that allows you to contract directly with the original author of the technology to maintain public safety. That is me. You can hire me directly as an independent municipal consultant, bypassing Optigrid entirely." Sarah Jenkins looked at me for a long moment, a slow smile replacing her tired expression. "You have thought this through, Gavin." "I have had plenty of free time for the last 4 days," I said. "But I have conditions. If I do this, I want complete creative control. My name goes on all the patents, the white papers, and the official city documentation. I will not have another executive claiming credit for my algorithms. And most importantly, I choose my own team. I want to hire back the 12 engineers Julian laid off last month, and I want my award to lead them." The mayor did not hesitate. "Done. Our legal team will draft the emergency contract tonight. We will notify Optigrid of the material breach at 9 tomorrow morning." As I walked out of the cafe, the cool evening air felt fresh. For the first time in days, the heavy weight in my chest was gone. I was not just going to save the city. I was going to dismantle Julian Thorne's entire empire, using the very laws he had tried to ignore. That evening, as I was preparing my notes for the next day, my phone rang again. It was Chloe. I answered on the final ring, curious to hear what she had to say now that the city was grindlocked. "Gavin," her voice was tight, thin, and stripped of the corporate confidence she usually wore like armor. "We need to meet. We need to talk about the system architecture." "We are talking now, Chloe," I replied, sitting back in my chair. "I know what you did," she said, trying to sound accusatory, but her voice lacked conviction. "The missing protocols, the undocumented overrides, the intentionally misleading variable names in the core files. You set me up to fail." I laughed, genuine amusement bubbling up. "Is that really what you think, Chloe? That I somehow predicted Julian would fire me, and I spent 3 years writing bad code just to spite you? The documentation is meticulous. It is over 400 pages of detailed API references. You just do not understand what you are reading, because you have never built anything in the real world." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice was much smaller. I need your help, Gavin. The system is failing and I do not know how to stop the cascade. Those 5 words must have cost her pride dearly. I took a slow breath, thinking of the way she had smiled when Julian toasted her as my replacement. I will meet you, I said. But not at the office. Meet me at the public library, main branch, 3rd floor study room at 10 lakh tomorrow morning, and do not bring any laptops or tablets. Just yourself and a notepad. When I walked into the study room the next morning, Chloe was already there. She looked like a ghost. Her hair was pulled back severely, her eyes were bloodshot, and she had deep dark circles under them. The polished Stanford consultant was gone, replaced by a terrified young engineer who had realized she was in way over her head. "Thank you for coming," she whispered as I sat down across from her. I opened my notebook, keeping my face expressionless. "Let us get one thing straight, Chloe. I am not here to salvage your career or help Julian save his contract." "I understand," she said, looking down at her hands. "Do you?" I asked. "You took my job. You stood there and smiled while security escorted me out. You told the board you could fix my mess." She had the decency to look away, her face flushing red. "I did not know they were going to fire you that day, Gavin. Julian told me it was a planned transition. But you knew you were replacing me," I countered. "You knew you were stepping into a role you were not qualified for. Now, tell me what is happening with the grid." For the next hour, Chloe detailed the cascading failures in the traffic sectors. As she spoke, the problem became painfully obvious. She had tried to impose standard textbook parameters on my organic system. She had run scripts to force identical timing cycles across different quadrants, believing that uniformity would create efficiency. "It is not logical," she complained, her pen tapping nervously against her notepad. "Sectors that have identical traffic volume and lane configurations are responding completely differently to the same inputs. Sector 4 is flowing, but Sector 7 is completely gridlocked. It makes no sense. That is because you are treating the system like a machine instead of a living organism," I explained, turning my notebook toward her. "The sectors are not identical because the people in them are not identical. Sector 4 is a commercial district with wide sidewalks and multiple subway exits. Sector 7 has narrow sidewalks, which means pedestrians bunch up at the crossings. When it rains, those pedestrians create unique delays because they crowd under shop awnings, blocking the right turn lanes. My engine measures those subtle environmental variables and adjusts the timing dynamically. You wipe those parameters out to implement your standardized models." Chloe stared at my diagrams, her mouth slightly open. "How do you systematize commuter psychology?" "You don't," I said. "You build an adaptive engine that learns from historical patterns and adjusts in real time. It is not about static rules, it is about relationships. Your conventional approaches are failing because they are too rigid for a chaotic world." She looked up at me, the arrogance completely gone from her eyes. "Can you fix it?" "I can," I said. "But it will cost you. What do you want? Money?" "I do not want Julian money," I replied. "I want the truth. Before I write a single line of code, I want the board to understand exactly what happened. I want you to stand before them and explain why the system failed under your management. I want full accountability." Chloe face-palmed. "Julian will never allow that. He is already preparing to tell the board that your code was fundamentally defective from the beginning. He is going to blame you for the entire crisis. Then the city stays gridlocked," I said, closing my notebook and standing up. "And Julian can explain to the city council why they are terminating the $12,000 contract." "Wait," she said, her voice shaking as she reached across the table. "What if I tell them myself? At the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning. If I tell them the truth, will you help us?" I paused at the door, looking back at her. "If you tell the truth, Chloe, I will make sure the city moves forward. But you have to make a choice between Julian lies and your own professional integrity." "I will be watching." The next morning, I dressed with extreme care. I put on my best charcoal gray suit, the one I had worn to my sister's wedding 2 years ago, and polished my shoes until they shone. This meeting was not about code, it was about power, and I intended to look the part. At 9:45 a.m., I walked through the glass doors of OptiGrid headquarters. The lobby was quiet, but the air felt thick with tension. I rode the elevator to the executive floor and walked straight to the waiting area outside the main boardroom. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Julian standing at the head of the table. He was projecting graphs showing red lines dropping off cliffs, gesturing wildly. Chloe sat to his right, staring down at her notepad, her shoulders tense. At exactly 10 a.m., the meeting began. I watched through the glass. Julian spoke first, his mouth moving in familiar rehearsed patterns. I could tell he was laying the groundwork to blame my experimental methods for the entire city crisis. Then, 15 minutes into the meeting, Chloe stood up. She did not look at Julian. She looked directly at the board chairman and began to speak. I watched Julian's face turn from confident to surprised, and then to a deep, furious red. He tried to interrupt her, slamming his hand on the table, but the chairman raised his hand, silencing him. Chloe kept talking. gesturing toward the slides she had prepared. She was telling them the truth. She was explaining that the code was perfect and that the failure was entirely due to her own attempts to force traditional algorithms onto an adaptive system. She was admitting her own limitations. At 10:35 a.m., the boardroom door opened. A security guard stepped out and looked at me. "Gavin Vance? The board would like you to join them." I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked into the room. A heavy silence fell over the long table. Every head turned toward me. "Gavin," the chairman said, his tone carefully neutral. "Miss Miller has just shared some very interesting information. She suggests that you are the only person who can stabilize the traffic grid, and that your termination was a grave mistake by management." Julian stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous. Gavin Vance is a former employee. We have proprietary rights to the system. We do not need him." "Actually, you do," a calm voice said from the doorway. We all turned to see Mayor Sarah Jenkins enter the room, flanked by two city lawyers. She looked sharp, energetic, and completely in control. "As of 9 this morning," the mayor announced, "the city has formally notified OptiGrid Systems of a material breach of contract under Section 14. You have failed to deliver a functional traffic grid for over 48 hours. We are terminating our $12,000 contract immediately. We are also clawing back the $3,000 in progress payments we have already paid you." Julian's face turned pale. "You cannot do that, Mayor. The software license is proprietary." "The software license is indeed proprietary," the mayor lawyer countered, stepping forward. "But under the terms of the agreement, the license is contingent on OptiGrid providing functional maintenance. By attempting to modify the code without the author consent, you violated the licensing terms, rendering the agreement void. The city has exercised its emergency powers to contract directly with Gavin Vance as an independent consultant." I looked at Julian, who looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "My system will be fully operational within 72 hours, I said, keeping my voice steady. "But it will be run by my new company, and I am hiring Maya Ward and the 12 engineers you laid off last month to build it. They will be getting a 20% pay raise funded by the $3,000,000 you are returning to the city." Julian sank back into his chair, utterly defeated. The real revenge did not happen in that boardroom. It happened 48 hours later, when I sat in the city municipal control center surrounded by my old team. We uploaded the original adaptive parameters back into the dynamic grid engine. Silently, elegantly, the red warnings on the monitors turned to green. The gridlock melted away, traffic flowed like water, and response times dropped back to record lows. The city was breathing again. 1 month later, I was walking downtown on my way to a meeting with the mayor. As I passed the OptiGrid headquarters, I noticed moving boxes stacked in the lobby. The company had filed for bankruptcy after losing the city contract and being forced to return the progress payments. Through the glass doors, I saw Julian standing near the reception desk, holding a single cardboard box. Our eyes met. I did not smile, and I did not gloat. I just nodded once, turned, and kept walking toward City Hall where my team was waiting. Because true revenge is not about destroying your enemies. It is about building something so much better that they become completely irrelevant. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or replaced by someone who did not understand your worth, you know how sweet this victory feels. Drop a comment sharing your own story of professional redemption. Like this video if you believe in standing up for your work, and subscribe to hear more stories of triumph over corporate toxicity. The game is never over until you say it is.